Nearly half the civilians on the island of Okinawa did not survive the spring of 1945. Many of them died holding grenades that the Japanese army had placed in their hands, along with instructions explaining that the weapons were meant for their own families. The officers who distributed them explained, through direct instruction and community messaging, what the grenades were for. They explained that to fall into American hands was a fate worse than death, that the enemy would conduct atrocities, that surrender was dishonor, that the only acceptable outcome for a civilian family caught in the fighting was to die together before the Americans could reach them. Approximately 240,000 Okinawan civilians died during the battle and its aftermath. The precise number is disputed in the records and continues to be debated by historians. What is not disputed is the general scale. And what is not disputed is the documented role of Japanese military instruction in shaping what civilian families did when they found themselves between an advancing American force and a retreating Japanese one. Okinawa was not a distant island that happened to be a battlefield. It had been Japanese territory for nearly 70 years. Its residents were Japanese citizens. They were also the population that the Japanese army in the spring of 1945 had decided to treat as a secondary consideration. Useful as logistic support, useful as a source of soldiers' labor, but ultimately subordinate to a defensive strategy that was designed to slow the Americans and inflict casualties, not to protect the people who lived there.
Okinawa's position in the Pacific War was geographic and strategic. The island sits approximately 540 kilometers southwest of the main Japanese island of Kyushu, close enough that an Allied airbase there would bring the entire Japanese home islands within range of land-based bombing. For the Americans, Okinawa was the final stepping stone before invasion. For the Japanese military, it was a place to make the Americans pay so dearly for their approach that they would reconsider the invasion entirely. The island and its people had a distinct identity. The Ryukyu Kingdom had existed as an independent polity for centuries before Japan formally annexed it in 1879. Many older residents still remembered, or had heard from parents who remembered, an Okinawa before Japanese rule. The Okinawan dialect was different enough from standard Japanese that communication between Okinawan civilians and mainland Japanese soldiers sometimes required effort. When the Japanese military began preparing the island's defenses in late 1944, this distinction was not treated as a reason for special consideration. Okinawan men were conscripted into auxiliary labor and combat units. Okinawan teenage boys were mobilized into student corps. Okinawan high school girls were mobilized as nursing auxiliaries. The island's population of approximately 500,000 was integrated into a defensive plan that had been designed in Tokyo by officers who would not be present when the fighting started, for objectives the local population had not been asked about and would not benefit from.
The Japanese defensive plan for Okinawa was designed by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, who arrived on the island in August of 1944 to command approximately 100,000 soldiers. Ushijima's plan was explicit about what the defense was meant to accomplish. The objective was not to defeat the American landing force. The objective was to inflict enough casualties to make the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands appear unacceptably costly to the American public and government. To achieve this, Ushijima concentrated his forces in the southern third of the island, where the terrain of ridges, caves, and limestone formations offered the best defensive positions. He did not plan to defend the beaches. He planned to let the Americans land, establish their supply lines, and then exact a price from them in attrition warfare that could be sustained for months. The civilian population of southern Okinawa was effectively embedded in this defensive zone. The caves that served as natural military positions also served as civilian shelters. The underground tunnel networks that Ushijima's engineers expanded for military use also connected to the spaces where families had moved to escape the American naval bombardment that began in late March. The defensive plan had not included a section on how to separate the military and civilian populations,
because separating them was not a priority. The civilians were already there. The army planned around them.
Before the battle began, and in the weeks as it intensified, the Japanese military communicated specific instructions to the Okinawan civilian population. The core message was consistent across its various forms. Surrender was not an option. The Americans would not treat prisoners humanely. To be captured was to invite violence against yourself and your family. To die fighting, or to die by your own hand, was preferable to capture. This message was conveyed through military officers addressing civilian assemblies. It was conveyed through local officials who repeated it in community meetings. It was conveyed in schools, where teachers, some of whom would shortly be mobilized as military nursing auxiliaries themselves, passed it to students as settled fact. The grenades distributed to families were explicitly framed as a final option. If the fighting reached you and escape was impossible, the grenade was how your family would meet its end together. The instructions for using them were provided. The military rationale was presented as protection from the enemy. What the civilians receiving these instructions could not know, because the information had not been shared with them, was that Japanese soldiers in earlier Pacific battles had in fact surrendered to American forces, and in most cases had been treated according to the laws of war. The premise on which the die rather than surrender instruction rested was not accurate. The instruction was given anyway. On the morning of April the 1st, 1945, approximately 180,000 American soldiers and Marines landed on the western coast of Okinawa. The landing was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. The initial landings encountered almost no resistance. Ushijima's plan had deliberately left the beaches undefended. The Americans moved inland cautiously, expecting ambushes that did not come. By the end of the first day, they had advanced several kilometers and captured Kadena Airfield without significant fighting. For approximately 5 days, the battle proceeded with unusual quiet. The Americans continued to advance south. Ushijima's forces waited in their prepared positions in the ridgeline country around Shuri. Civilians in the south had already moved to caves and shelters in anticipation of what was coming. The American naval bombardment, which had begun weeks before the landing, had already killed an unknown number of civilians and destroyed a significant portion of the housing stock in the southern towns. The quiet ended in early April when American forces reached the outer defenses of the Shuri line. What followed was 82 days of some of the most intense infantry combat of the entire Pacific War. The terrain amplified the suffering. The limestone ridges and cave networks meant that every position had to be taken at close range, from multiple directions, often with flamethrowers and demolition charges, because the caves were otherwise impervious to artillery. The civilians who had taken shelter in those caves were inside the same positions. As the battle moved south, Okinawan civilians found themselves in a situation that the grenade distribution briefings had not fully described. The caves and tunnels that served as civilian shelters often connected to military positions. Japanese soldiers shared caves with families. Japanese soldiers sometimes occupied caves that had been civilian shelters and ordered the families inside to leave or to move deeper into the tunnel system. In some cases, Japanese soldiers used civilian presence as cover, placing defensive positions where civilian groups were sheltering, understanding that American forces would be more cautious about attacking positions where non-combatants were visible. In other cases, soldiers interpreted civilian presence in military-adjacent spaces as potential espionage and reacted with violence. There are documented cases of Japanese soldiers killing Okinawan civilians, including some who spoke to American forces or were perceived as potentially doing so, because the military's operational security framework treated an uncertain civilian as a risk. The civilians were caught between an advancing enemy they had been told would kill them and an army that treated their presence as a tactical variable rather than a responsibility. The situation in the caves in the spring of 1945 was not the scenario the military briefings had described: a clear enemy,
a clear choice, a grenade in your hand. It was chaos in the dark, with people you knew on one side and strangers with flamethrowers on the other, and the instructions you had been given providing no guidance for what was actually happening.
In January of 1945, the Japanese military mobilized the students and teachers of Okinawa's high schools for wartime service. The Himeyuri unit, formerly the Okinawa Prefectural First Women's High School and Okinawa Normal School Girls Division, was among the groups called up. 222 students, ranging in age from 15 to 19, and 18 teachers were assigned to serve as nursing auxiliaries in the underground field hospitals of the Japanese Army. The students had no medical training. They learned as they worked, in tunnels cut into the limestone beneath the hills, caring for wounded soldiers in conditions that deteriorated as the battle intensified. The tunnels were poorly ventilated. Supplies ran low. Wounded soldiers arrived faster than they could be treated. The students carried water and supplies through tunnels that were under artillery fire. They assisted in surgeries by lamplight. Several were killed by direct fire or by artillery fragments entering the medical tunnels. By June, when the Japanese defensive line had collapsed and the army was retreating to the southernmost tip of the island, the situation in the medical tunnels had become critical. The wounded could not move. The students and teachers who had been caring for them were physically exhausted, and in many cases had been in the tunnels for months without meaningful rest. And then, on June the 18th, the Japanese military issued a dissolution order for the Himeyuri unit. The students and teachers were told that their service was complete, and they should act on their own initiative. The dissolution order was, in practical terms, an abandonment. The students were released from their assigned positions in the medical tunnels without transportation, without an escort, without information about where the front lines were, without any plan for how they would reach safety. They emerged from the tunnels into a battlefield that had been contracting around them for weeks. Some made it to areas where they could surrender to American forces. Some did not. In the weeks between the dissolution order and the formal end of organized resistance on June the 22nd, approximately 136 of the 240 students and teachers of the Himeyuri unit died. Most died in the open, caught between retreating Japanese forces and advancing American ones. Some died when the cave shelters they reached were attacked. Some used the grenades they had been given when they found themselves cornered with no other option. The youngest student who died was 15 years old. She had been mobilized by the same military that had trained her teachers in the same schools where she had studied, under the same administrative structure that governed every aspect of Okinawan institutional life. The dissolution order that effectively sent her and her classmates into a battlefield without guidance is preserved in the Japanese military archive. It is signed by a senior officer who was, at the time he signed it, conducting a fighting retreat and managing the disposition of approximately 50,000 remaining soldiers. The dissolution of a nursing auxiliary unit was one of many administrative decisions made that day. There is no record that it was treated as anything else.
By late May, the Japanese defensive line at Shuri had been broken. Ushijima's forces were retreating south to a final defensive position at the island's southern tip. The retreat moved through civilian territory, and the civilians moved with it, or were caught in it. The army's retreat pulled the battle south faster than many civilians could follow, and the space between the retreating army and the advancing American forces became a zone of extraordinary danger. American forces, advancing cautiously through terrain that had proved deadly, were encountering civilians mixed with combatants in configurations that were difficult to distinguish. American soldiers had been told that Japanese civilians might be combatants or might assist combatants. Some American soldiers were cautious, some were not. The civilian deaths in this period came from multiple directions simultaneously. Japanese soldiers retreating through civilian areas sometimes forced civilians from their cave shelters to take the space for military use.
In documented cases, Japanese soldiers killed civilians who were perceived as obstacles or as security risks. People who spoke Okinawan dialect, which Japanese soldiers from the mainland sometimes could not distinguish from American-facing communication. People who had food or water that the retreating army needed. People who were in a position that the army needed to use. The civilians were caught in a logic that had been designed without them. The army's retreat was following a military plan. The civilians' suffering was a byproduct of that plan. Not an objective in itself, but also not something that had been given significant weight when the plan was designed.
The mass civilian deaths at Okinawa include deaths by suicide and by mutual killing within families. The documented instances cluster in the final weeks of organized resistance, when civilian groups were cornered at the southern cliffs with nowhere to retreat. The pattern, documented in survivor testimonies and in the accounts of American soldiers who witnessed or reached the sites afterward, is consistent. Groups of civilians, sometimes extended families, sometimes neighbors, sometimes strangers who had sheltered together, found themselves at the cliff edge or in the final caves, with Japanese soldiers nearby and American forces advancing. The grenades they had been given, or the instructions they had received about suicide as an honorable alternative to capture, were the framework within which families made decisions. The testimonies of survivors describe the moments before as deeply specific and human. The arguments about whether to do it, the people who refused, the people who tried to stop others, the children who did not understand what was happening. These moments are not the clean, framed sacrifice that the military briefings had described. They are the result of bad information, the incorrect claim that the Americans would conduct atrocities, combined with genuine terror, combined with a social pressure to conform to what the person next to you was doing, in a physical situation with no clear exit. The survivors who spoke publicly in the decades after the war were often specific about this. The military's instruction had given them a framework, but the framework was not accurate, and they had not known it was not accurate, and this mattered. The American military distributed leaflets over the island throughout the battle, addressed to the civilian population. The leaflets stated, in Japanese, that civilians who surrendered would be treated humanely, fed, and protected. They provided instructions for approaching American positions safely. They described the conditions in the prisoner of war camps where civilians were being held, which were, by most accounts, significantly better than the conditions in the caves where the fighting was still ongoing. The Japanese military's response to these leaflets was to instruct civilians not to read them or believe them, to treat them as enemy propaganda, and to destroy them. Some soldiers reportedly threatened civilians who were found with the leaflets. In the last weeks of the battle, as more civilians emerged from caves and surrendered to American forces, the gap between what the leaflets had promised and what the military had warned about became visible. The civilians who surrendered were, in the vast majority of cases, not harmed. They were fed. They were placed in holding areas and then in camps. They were eventually returned to their homes or to the ruins where their homes had been. The civilians who had received the same information as those who surrendered, but had acted on the military's instructions rather than the leaflets, were in many cases dead. The difference between the two outcomes was, in a direct sense, a question of which source of information the person had decided to trust and why. The Himeyuri students who emerged from the dissolution order into open terrain faced a version of this choice in real time. Some encountered American soldiers. Some accounts describe being taken prisoner calmly and safely. Some accounts describe being caught in fire from both sides simultaneously. Some accounts describe reaching groups of Japanese soldiers who ordered them back into dangerous positions. The ones who survived did so through combinations of luck, judgment, and the absence of the particular circumstances that killed others. None of the accounts describe a situation that resembled the one they had been prepared for in the briefings. The briefings had described a clear enemy. What they found was a battlefield with no clear boundaries, with people from every category,
Soldiers, civilians, students, Americans, present in the same physical space and responding to each other in ways that the categories did not predict. One survivor, interviewed in her 60s, was asked what she thought about when she thought about those final weeks. She said, "I think about the people who chose differently than I did and did not survive, and I try to understand what was different about their situation that made them choose what they chose. I have been thinking about this for 40 years. I have not found an answer that satisfies me. I think this is because the answer is not in their choice. The answer is in the situation that was created for them. They were put there by people who knew they would be there and were never asked whether they consented to be there."
On June the 22nd, 1945, Lieutenant General Ushijima and his chief of staff died at the southern tip of Okinawa. Organized Japanese military resistance ended. The formal battle was over. The dying was not. Isolated soldiers continued fighting in caves and tunnels for weeks. Civilian casualties continued during this period as American forces cleared positions. The count of dead civilians, which was impossible to establish precisely during the fighting, began to be assembled afterward from a combination of military records, family records, community records, and survivor testimony. The numbers that emerged from this process were contested and continue to be contested. The range commonly cited by historians is between 94,000 and 150,000 civilian deaths from direct violence. When deaths from disease, malnutrition, and the medical consequences of displacement are included, the estimate rises to approximately 240,000, roughly half the pre-war civilian population of the island. These are not precise figures. The records that would allow precision were largely destroyed in the fighting. What the figures represent is an order of magnitude, and the order of magnitude is unambiguous. The civilian population of Okinawa experienced the spring of 1945 as a catastrophe, from which some people emerged and a very large number did not.
The question that runs through the post-war testimony of Okinawan survivors is a specific one. What did the Japanese army owe to the people whose island it was using as a battlefield? The army's implicit answer, expressed through its planning and its conduct, was that it owed the civilian population protection to the extent that protection was compatible with the military mission, and that the military mission took priority. The army had a different set of obligations to the defense of Japan than it had to the welfare of Okinawan civilians specifically. Okinawa was the terrain. The civilians were, in the military logic of the time, either an asset, as labor, as locally sourced support, or a neutral factor. Some of the officers who commanded units on Okinawa were tried after the war for specific acts against civilians. Some were convicted. Most were not tried. The command decision to arm civilians with grenades, to instruct them that surrender was equivalent to death, to distribute information that the army knew or should have known was inaccurate, these decisions were not addressed in the post-war prosecutions in a systematic way. Okinawan survivors and their descendants pursued recognition of what had happened through Japanese courts and through political advocacy for decades after the war. The debate about how the battle is characterized in Japanese school textbooks has continued into the present century and has not been resolved to the satisfaction of survivors and their descendants. What the Okinawa civilian casualty numbers meant for Allied planning was concrete and immediate. The figures from the battle, approximately 12,000 American soldiers killed, approximately 72,000 wounded, approximately 100,000 Japanese soldiers killed, were presented to the Allied military and political leadership as data points for estimating what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost. The projection, developed by military planners in the summer of 1945, was that an invasion of Kyushu in the fall would produce between 250,000 and 1 million American casualties, and Japanese military and civilian deaths that could reach several million. The Okinawa battle was the reference point from which these numbers were derived. The atomic bombs were detonated in August of 1945, before the invasion took place.
The civilian death tolls in the two bombed cities, estimated in the range of 70 to 200,000, were of a different order than what had occurred at Okinawa, but they produced the same kind of question about military decision-making and civilian populations. This question, what civilians are owed when the military's objectives require putting them in danger, is the question that runs through the Okinawa story and connects it to the larger story of how the Pacific War ended.
The Himeyuri Peace Museum opened near the site of a cave where many of the Himeyuri students died in the southern part of Okinawa. It was built with the participation of survivors and documents the experience of the student nursing unit and the wider civilian population in the battle. The survivors who contributed to its construction spent years recording and organizing their testimony.
One of the things the museum documents, with particular care, is the gap between what the students had been taught to expect and what they encountered. The museum describes the military briefings, the instructions, the framing that made dying seem like the only acceptable choice. And it documents, carefully, the testimonies of students who did not follow those instructions and survived, and what those students said about the choice they made. What they said, consistently, was that they had decided, in a moment of specific and concrete circumstance, to disbelieve what they had been told. They had looked at the situation in front of them. The Americans were close, the soldiers were retreating. The briefing had said the Americans would kill them, but what they saw in front of them was a situation in which surrender seemed less certain to kill them than the alternative, and they had made a judgment based on what they could see, rather than what they had been told to believe. This is a small thing to hold against a number in the range of 240,000, but the survivor said it was the thing worth saying.
The Okinawa story is not primarily about what happened to the soldiers. The soldiers who fought at Okinawa, the American soldiers who took the ridge lines, the Japanese soldiers who defended the cave networks, experienced something terrible. The battle's place in Pacific War history is real and documented. But the approximately 240,000 Okinawan civilians who died in the battle did not choose to be in the path of two armies. They were there because the island they lived on had been selected as a battlefield, and because the military that claimed to represent them had designed a defense that used their presence as a strategic factor without consulting them about it. And because the information they had been given about their choices was systematically inaccurate. This is a distinction that matters. The soldiers made a choice, under institutional pressure, within a specific framework. But the framework allowed for something recognizable as choice. The civilians who received grenades and instructions did not choose the situation they were in. They were placed in it by decisions made at levels above them, by people who would not be present when those decisions produced their consequences. What the Himeyuri survivors said, what the cave survivors said, what the people who surrendered early said, all of it comes back to the same point. The information they were given was not accurate. The people who gave them inaccurate information were the people whose job it was to protect them. And the gap between those two facts is where the 240,000 are. The officers who commanded at Okinawa, Ushijima, who died at the southern tip on June the 22nd, and his senior staff, were not tried for war crimes related to the civilian casualty decisions. Ushijima's suicide prevented any post-war accounting for the specific decisions he made about civilian population management. The question of whether the instruction to arm civilians with grenades and tell them surrender was death constituted a war crime was not addressed systematically in the Tokyo trials. What was addressed in subsequent decades, through Okinawan political advocacy and through the broader Japanese national reckoning with the war's conduct, was the question of how these events should be understood and remembered. The debates about Okinawa in Japanese national memory have been politically contentious in ways that other parts of the Pacific War story have not been. The Okinawa story is complicated because the civilians who died were Japanese citizens,
They were not an occupied population in the way that Korean or Chinese civilians were. But their experience of the Japanese military was, in many documented cases, one of being harmed by the institution that claimed to protect them. This creates a tension in national memory that has not been resolved and that Okinawans have continued to press. The museum exists. The testimony is recorded. The specific teachers and students who died are named. The gap between the numbers and the names is the work that the survivors have spent decades doing.
The Battle of Okinawa was one of the primary data points that led to the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan. The military planners who developed the invasion casualty projections in the summer of 1945 were working from Okinawa numbers. The political leadership that reviewed those projections and weighed them against the expected casualties from atomic bombardment was making a calculation that had Okinawa as its foundation. This does not close the ethical question about either decision, the decision to fight Okinawa the way it was fought, or the decision to use the bombs, but it establishes the connection between them. The civilian casualties at Okinawa were one of the inputs into a calculation that produced the civilian casualties at the two bombed cities. And the civilian casualties at those two cities were one of the inputs into the calculation that produced the surrender. The chain is traceable. Every link in it involves a decision made by people who knew, to varying degrees, what the consequences would be, and who made the decision anyway, for reasons that can be explained, but not simply excused. This is what the Pacific War looks like when you follow it through from the individual to the institutional to the strategic level and back. The Okinawan civilians who died did not decide any of this. They were at the bottom of several chains of decision-making, and what happened to them was the result of all of them simultaneously.
There is a detail in the Himeyuri documentation that takes a long time to absorb. The dissolution order, the military document that sent the students into the open battlefield without escort or plan, was signed on June the 18th, 1945. The American landings had begun April the 1st. The students had been in the tunnels for 2.5 months. They had watched the battle contract around them. They had carried water through tunnels under artillery fire. They had done, in other words, what they had been mobilized to do. The order that dissolved their unit did not say anything about what they should do next. It did not provide for their safety. It used bureaucratic language. Their service is complete. Act on your own initiative. That had no operative content in a situation where the initiative available to 15-year-old girls in a battlefield consisted of trying to reach American lines without being shot by anyone on either side. 136 of them died in the weeks after that order was signed. The order itself took approximately 1 minute to draft. The people who were in the vicinity and could have done something about it, the senior officers who were present and active on June the 18th, were conducting military operations and making military decisions. The dissolution of a nursing auxiliary was not the most important decision on anyone's desk that day. This is what institutions do with people at their edges. They make one decision for reasons that make sense from the center, and at the edge, someone who was 15 years old finds herself in open ground between two armies with nowhere to go. Next on Torah Files. On the morning of August the 6th, 1945, a Japanese engineer survived the world's first atomic bomb in Hiroshima. He was 3 kilometers from the epicenter. The next day, he boarded a train home to Nagasaki. On August the 9th, as he stood in his office, describing to a disbelieving supervisor what one bomb had done to Hiroshima, the second bomb detonated above the city. He survived that one too.